Why was my flight cancelled? Staff dearths disrupt airlines as summer trip season takes off. Don't anticipate the flight cancellations and detainments that agonized the July 4th weekend to end anytime soon. Ravi Sarati, professor of transnational business and strategy at Northeastern University, says cancellations, detainments, and the rising cost of breakouts will presumably get worse before they get better. Labor dearths and bad rainfall will continue to produce turbulence in the assiduity, he says. Until they resolve the staffing dearths, it presumably won't get better, Sarati says. There were further than 000 domestic flight cancellations over the July 4th weekend. On July 5th, nearly 600 further were cancelled and about 500 were delayed, according to FlightAware, a company that tracks airline assiduity. The dislocations continued through the rest of the week, with about 300 cancellations and 000 detainments each day. So far this time, the cancellation rate has been about 3, says Kathleen Bangs, a prophet for FlightAware. By comparison, she says, the cancellation rate in 2019 was lower than 2 but went up to 12 in 2020 during the epidemic. The high volume of summer breakouts has put a huge burden on the airlines, which reduced staff, airplanes, and breakouts during the COVID-19 epidemic. Like numerous diligents, airlines are also facing inflationary issues, including energy costs that have further than doubled over the last time. Numerous airline labor force, from baggage instructors to aviators, took buyouts, redundancies, and layoffs during the epidemic, as airlines' cargo factors hit 20 to 30, and half-empty airplanes. We're losing plutocrat, Sarati says. Airline assiduity employment is on the answer since the epidemic, but figures still lag behind pandemic summations. In February of 2020, passenger airline employment was at a peak of 200 jobs, according to Airlines for America, an airline trade association and promoting group. The epidemic low point was in November of 2020 at 500 jobs. In April of this time, the aggregate climbed to 600, still short of pandemic figures. Bangs says the staffing deficit is the reason for the recent detainments and cancellations. She says the onboarding process for new workers is slow because of background checks and training. The demand for the trip came surging back, but it's like turning around a battleship, she says. Aviators who took a buyout or early withdrawal during the epidemic would have to start at the bottom of the senility list if they wanted to come back, Bangs says, so that can be interference with returning to the job. I suppose they've had a harder time attracting people than they allowed. They would, Bangs says. The airlines also took a lot of airplanes out of service during the epidemic as they cut back on routes with similar low demand. Now, Sarati says, they're floundering to restock their lines. It takes 2 to 3 times to get delivery of a new passenger airplane, and with only 2 aircraft makers, Boeing and Airbus, the airlines cannot meet the current demand. Bringing back planes taken out of commission isn't always effective, he says. In December of 2019, before the epidemic, there were 780 passenger airplanes in service, according to Airlines for America. In December 2020, the assiduity had 671 airplanes. The assiduity started adding airplanes and service in 2021, finishing the time with 427 airplanes. At the end of June this time, there were 570 airplanes in service. Another factor contributing to this perfect storm in the assiduity is the rainfall. The unpredictable summer rainfall has caused a shaft in detainments and cancellations, Sarati says, and those indigenous rainfall issues have a slinging effect across the country. I suppose it should get better in the fall, Sarati says, because the summer holiday demand will subside and a possible recession could dwindle consumer spending on airfare. As we ease into fall, and seminaries renew, people go back to work after recesses, The business swell should decelerate, allowing for better route planning and smaller cancellations, Sarati says. The price of airfare is formally down for breakouts in the fall, Bangs points out. But the rainfall itself isn't the problem, Bangs says. There has not been a lesser number of rainfall events this time, but when there's detention because of rainfall, the airlines don't have the staff to acclimate and register. They just don't have the force to meet those rainfall events, she says. The high demand has caused a swell in the cost of airfare. The assiduity suffered significant losses a couple of times during the COVID-19 epidemic, Sarati says, and now the airlines are trying to recover. Because demand is over, prices go over, Bangs says. Part of that's the cost of energy, that will always be the case. The airlines, like so numerous diligents, are greatly affected by the rising cost of energy. Spot energy prices equaled $4.21 in June this time, up 122 from $1.90 in June 2021, according to Airlines for America. As airlines add further airplanes and further breakouts, I suppose the prices will come down, Sarati says. U.S. airlines are projected to post modest gains in 2022, according to Airlines for America, and companies will use those gains to retire the massive debt accumulated in 2020 to 2021 to rainfall the epidemic. The association says airline assiduity debt, and interest expenditure, will remain elevated through at least 2024. Their pandemic tax profit periphery for airlines was 9.6 from 2017 to 2019, still, in 2021 the assiduity was running in the red at 2.6. Qantas drops vaccine accreditation for transnational breakouts. Qantas will stop checking the vaccination status of its transnational passengers coming week. Qantas will end its no-poke no-fly rule for transnational passengers coming week. In line with changed Australian government rules, Qantas will end its policy of not flying unvaccinated passengers on its transnational service on July 19. Still, the airline warns some countries still only allow vaccinated trippers and advises passengers to check their destination entry conditions. Qantas drops a policy that has passed its use-by date. Qantas enforced the no-poke no-fly rule across its transnational breakouts last time as Australia's borders began continuing. At the time, the move enjoyed broad public support. Qantas also claimed all its workers be vaccinated, anyhow of their part. Also extensively supported, that decision saw some review, including from a small group of workers who refused vaccinations. But by mid-2022, further than 95 Australians aged 16 or over are completely vaccinated, and the period of unrestricted borders in Australia at least appears over. Demand for seats on breakouts in and out of Australia is high, and the changes in the Australian government and Qantas programs reflect the wide public mood to get on with life. From Tuesday, July 19, 2022, the Qantas Group will no longer bear passengers on transnational breakouts operated by the Qantas Group to be completely vaccinated against COVID-19, says a Qantas statement. This follows the Australian government removing the evidence of COVID-19 vaccination demand for transnational trippers coming to Australia. Vaccinations may still be needed by certain countries, so passengers should check the conditions of the country they're traveling to. Qantas continues to apply a heist bag of mask-wearing rules. This week, OAG data indicates just over 000 transnational seats were available on breakouts to and from Australia, still over 46 down on the similar week in 2019. But this time last time, away from some ad hoc extradition breakouts, Qantas' transnational network was at a deadlock. Still, planning was in full swing for a resumption of breakouts, and that planning included a raft of new trip rules, including vaccinations and masks. At this point, the vaccination rule for Qantas workers remains in place. Qantas Group workers will still need to be completely vaccinated against COVID-19 in line with Qantas Group policy, the airline statement says. Qantas is facing a legal challenge from a group of former Qantas workers who lost their jobs over their vaccination station. Meanwhile, Australia's confusing heist bag of mask-wearing rules on airlines remains in place. Masks will continue to be needed where government regulations stipulate they must be worn, including on-board domestic breakouts in Australia, the statement adds. But the mask-wearing rules on transnational breakouts vary depending on the destination. The Australian government still requires masks to be worn during breakouts in Australia. As a result, on some Qantas transnational routes, it's mask-free on the outbound run and masks on for the inbound flight.